They thought she was too old to fight. They brought legal papers to her house right after her husband passed away and demanded she sign over everything she had spent her life building. They called it protecting family assets. But in reality, it was a robbery. And the person behind it all was none other than her daughter-in-law, the woman she had welcomed into her home as her own daughter for the past 20 years. If you think this story is just about money, you're wrong. This is a story about betrayal, about dignity, and about a 72-year-old woman who proved she has never, and never will, been a loser. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories, because I guarantee you what awaits you at the end of this story will leave you speechless. Press like now, and leave a comment letting me know which city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far my story has traveled in the world. The day my husband died, I sat beside his bed for 6 hours before I let anyone take him away. I didn't cry in front of the nurses. I didn't cry in front of my son Nathan, who stood near the window looking at his phone more than he looked at his father. I held Richard's hand until it went cold, and I didn't let go until I was ready. 48 years. That's how long we had been married. 48 years of building something together from nothing more than a handshake deal on a borrowed dock in Charleston, South Carolina, and the stubborn belief that two people who loved each other could outwork everyone else. I let go of his hand when I was ready, not a moment before. That was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my daughter-in-law Vanessa was sitting in my living room with a stack of legal documents on her knees and a look on her face like she had already won something. I remember exactly what she was wearing: a cream silk blouse, pressed slacks, pearl earrings. She'd dressed for a business meeting, not a condolence visit. I remember thinking that very clearly. She dressed for a negotiation, not a grief call. And I sat across from her in the same armchair I had sat in for 30 years, in the same house Richard and I bought when the company was finally profitable enough that we didn't have to count every dollar before the end of each month. And I looked at this woman who had been in my family for 22 years, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not shock, not even anger, not yet. Just a slow spreading coldness. The kind that comes when you realize something you half suspected for years has finally stepped out of the shadows and put its name on paper. "Evelyn," Vanessa said, and she gave me that smile. The practiced one, the one that never quite touched the outer corners of her eyes. "I know the timing is terrible. I want you to know that Nathan and I discussed this at length, and we both felt that you needed to have this conversation sooner rather than later, for your own sake." "For my sake," I repeated. "You've been under extraordinary stress. Richard's illness, the funeral arrangements, the media attention." She gestured vaguely, as if she was brushing away something unpleasant. "You're 72 years old, Evelyn. No one would blame you for stepping back." I looked at the documents on her knees. I could read the letterhead from where I sat. Whitmore Global Shipping, my company. My name was at the top of those papers, and not in a good way. Not in the way a founder's name appears on a charter, in the way a signature line appears at the bottom of a transfer agreement. "Where's Nathan?" I asked. He couldn't be here today. He's dealing with some things at the office." "He couldn't attend a meeting about his mother's future." Something crossed her face, a small tightening around the jaw. "He trusts me to represent both of us." I let the silence stretch. One beat, two. I've learned over the years that silence makes certain kinds of people very uncomfortable, and that what they say to fill it is almost always more honest than anything they plan to say. Vanessa filled it quickly. "The board has concerns," she said, her voice dropping into something professionally sympathetic. "They've expressed privately that they're worried about leadership continuity. With Richard gone, and given your age and your current emotional state—" "My emotional state," I said quietly. "They feel that a transition would be the responsible choice. Logan is 19. He has 2 years at Wharton ahead of him, but with Nathan and I providing guidance, he could take the chairman title in a functional capacity while the management team continues to—" "Vanessa." My voice came out very flat, very even. I noticed her stop mid-sentence, which told me she had been expecting something different. Tears, maybe. Or protest. Or the wobbly uncertainty of a woman in grief who could be nudged into agreement with enough reassurance. "Logan is 19 years old. With proper support, he can barely operate a washing machine without calling me for instructions." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes shifted. "That's why Nathan and I would Manage everything behind the scenes. I looked at her very steadily, while a 19-year-old sits in my chair. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The answer was already on the papers resting on her knees. I stood up. I am 5'3" and I weigh 134 pounds, and I have arthritis in my left knee that makes itself known on cold mornings, and standing up from that armchair was not the graceful move I would have liked it to be. But I stood, and I looked down at Vanessa Cole, who had the good sense to look slightly uncertain for the first time since she walked through my door. "Leave the documents," I said. "I'll have my attorney review them." "Of course." She rose, setting the papers on the coffee table. "I hope you understand this comes from a place of care, Evelyn. We just want what's best for the family." "I know exactly what you want," I said. I walked her to the door myself. I didn't call for the housekeeper. I watched her cross the driveway to her car, a Mercedes I had never seen before, new, charcoal gray. And I noticed she was already on her phone before she reached the driver's side door. I closed the front door. I stood in my own hallway, in the house I had lived in for 3 decades, and I allowed myself exactly 45 seconds of feeling what I actually felt, which was something close to devastation. Not because I was surprised, but because even when you suspect something, there's still a particular kind of grief that arrives when it's confirmed. When the thing you hoped you were wrong about turns out to be exactly as ugly as you feared. I gave myself 45 seconds. Then I walked to Richard's study, sat down at his desk, and started making calls. I need you to understand something about who I am before I tell you what happened next, because none of what I did in the weeks that followed will make sense if you think of me as a woman who sat quietly while her husband handled the difficult things. Richard and I built Whitmore Global Shipping together. I say that plainly, not as a correction or a complaint, but as a fact. There are people, many of them, who prefer to remember it as Richard's company that Evelyn helped with. There were journalists who wrote it that way. There were board members who spoke to me as though I was a very capable assistant rather than a co-founder. Richard himself, to his credit, never allowed that to stand unchallenged. He would correct people in rooms where correcting them was socially costly, and he never once seemed to mind paying that cost. But the world has a way of assigning credit based on who it expects to deserve it. What Richard handled, the negotiations, the relationship side, the dinners and the handshakes, and the read of a room that comes from a certain kind of personality. He was warm in a way I am not. He could make a man feel like an old friend 20 minutes into their first conversation. What I handled, the architecture of the thing, the contracts, the systems, the financial controls, the contingency planning. When we hit our first major cash flow crisis in 1987, 3 vessels stuck in port due to a labor dispute and creditors calling twice a day, I was the one who built the restructuring plan that kept us solvent. Richard was the one who sat across from the bank and made them believe in it. We were good partners. What Vanessa had apparently failed to account for was that partnership. She had watched Richard carry the visible weight of the company in his later years. The speeches, the board meetings, the industry conferences, while my health scares and my preferences kept me more in the background. She had mistaken that for irrelevance. She had mistaken quieter for weaker. That was her first mistake. My attorney, Victor Hale, arrived at my house on Friday morning. Victor is 61, former federal prosecutor, and has represented Whitmore Global Shipping for 18 years. He is one of maybe 6 people in the world I trust without qualification. And that trust was built slowly, on a foundation of him telling me things I didn't want to hear and being right about them. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room, the kitchen, because I was tired and I wanted coffee, and I didn't have energy for staging. And he read through the documents Vanessa had left. When he finished, he set them down and looked at me over his reading glasses. "These are aggressive," he said. "Yes. They want full operational control transferred within 30 days. I read them." He turned back a page, read something again, then set the papers down a second time. "The board concerns she referenced? I haven't heard anything from the board. Neither have I. Which means either the board doesn't know they're being cited, or someone has already been working on them." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. "Victor, I need to know what's been happening at the company while I was occupied with Richard's illness." He was quiet for a moment. "I can ask around, quietly." "Do that." I paused. "And I need you to pull up our system access logs. I tried to log into the executive financial portal this morning. Victor looked at me. I was locked out, I said. The silence in my kitchen had a particular quality to it. Victor is not a man who shows alarm easily, but something moved behind his eyes, and he reached for his own phone. When did that happen? The prompt appeared this morning. Access restricted. Contact system administrator. I've been logging into that system for 12 years. I'll call Marcus. Don't. He stopped, looked at me. Not yet, I said. I don't want Marcus to know I noticed. Victor understood. He's good at reading what's underneath what someone says. All right. He closed his notebook. Where do you want to start? I looked out the kitchen window. The garden Richard loved was already starting to go untended. Just a week since the funeral, and already the edges were losing their precision, which is the thing about order. The moment you stop fighting for it, entropy doesn't wait. It starts immediately. I want to start, I said, by finding out exactly how long this has been in progress. What I found over the next 3 days, alone, using a system backup that no one knew I had maintained, came close to breaking me. Not because I wasn't capable of understanding it. I understood it perfectly. That was exactly the problem. The backup system was something I built into Whitmore Global's infrastructure in 2004, after we survived a ransomware attack that could have destroyed everything. A parallel record-keeping architecture, running quietly in the background, capturing transaction data and access logs on a separate server that wasn't connected to the main administrative system. I told Richard about it. I told no one else. I sat at the desk in Richard's study for 3 days with a large monitor and 4 yellow legal pads, and I went through 2 years of transaction records, and what I found there was not the work of an opportunist who spotted a grieving window. What I found was the work of architects. Someone had been very careful, very patient, and very thorough. The transfers began small, amounts below the threshold that would trigger automatic audit flags. But they were consistent, and they were patterned, and when I mapped them across the timeline, they formed a structure. Funds moving from operating accounts into 3 shell corporations I had never authorized. The shells had names that sounded adjacent to legitimate logistics vendors. If you were glancing, if you were moving fast, if you were not looking for it, you might not notice. You might attribute it to normal vendor transactions. I was not glancing. I was not moving fast. The amounts, when totaled, were not small. Over 22 months, the transfers totaled just over $8 million. And when I traced the destination accounts with the help of a forensic accountant I had used before and trusted completely, a woman named Patricia Huang, who flew down from Boston without asking me to explain why over the phone, what we found on the other end of that money was not a legitimate vendor. It was a retirement fund. My company's retirement fund, the one that held the accumulated savings of 743 employees, people who had driven trucks, managed warehouses, processed freight, crewed vessels. People who had worked for Whitmore Global for 20, 25, 30 years. People who had trusted that the company they built their lives around was keeping their future safe. That money wasn't being stolen out the front door. It was being cycled, routed through the shells, and redirected in a pattern Patricia described to me quietly, sitting across from me in Richard's study at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, as one of the more methodically constructed embezzlement schemes she had encountered in 18 years of forensic accounting. I listened to her explain it without interrupting. When she finished, I asked, who had access to execute these transactions? She had her laptop open. She turned it to face me. There were 2 names with administrative access to the retirement fund transfer system. The first was Marcus Vane, my financial officer, a man I had hired personally 17 years ago. I stared at his name for a long time. Then I looked at the second name, and the cold that had started in my chest when Vanessa sat down in my living room, that slow, spreading coldness I had been managing for 3 days, dropped several degrees lower. The second name was one I recognized not from the company, but from a document I had found that afternoon in Richard's old files. A name attached to a personal email account I had never seen before. A communication history that went back 14 years. Marcus Vane hadn't acted alone, and this had not started when Richard died. It had started while Richard was still very much alive, and someone in my family had known about it. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. Patricia was watching me. Outside the study window, the garden was dark. Patricia, I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me because my hands were not. I'm going to need you to stay in Charleston for a while. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news for a living and knows when there is worse ahead. How long? I looked back at the screen, at the name, at the 14-year-old trail of messages I hadn't yet finished reading. As long as it takes, I said. Patricia stayed. She moved into the guest room at the far end of the second floor without complaint, brought 2 suitcases and a portable hard drive and a habit of making tea at 2 in the morning that I came to find quietly comforting during the nights we worked late. She was methodical in a way that reminded me of myself at her age. Before the years had taught me that methodical alone isn't enough, that you also need to know when to stop gathering information and start acting on it. We weren't ready to act yet, but we were getting close. The documents Vanessa had left on my coffee table sat in a manila folder on the corner of Richard's desk, untouched. Victor had advised me not to respond to them formally until we understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. I agreed. There's an old principle in negotiation that Richard used to cite. Never make a move when you only understand part of the board. I understood perhaps 40% of the board. That was not enough. What I did in those first days after Patricia arrived was something I had not done in years. I sat still and I read. I read every communication I could access through the backup system. I read transaction records and access logs and the digital trail that people leave when they believe no one is watching them carefully enough to piece it together. And I found the emails. Not many. Whoever had written them was careful. Short messages, oblique language, nothing that would read as incriminating to someone who didn't already know the context. But context was something I had in abundance. I had 48 years of context. I had 17 years of watching Marcus Vane operate inside my company, and I knew his voice on paper the same way I knew his voice in a meeting room. I knew when he was being precise and when he was being evasive. I knew the difference between his professional tone and his personal one. These emails were personal. They were sent from a private account, not his company address, to a name I didn't recognize at first. The name was listed as D. Harlow. The account was registered to a personal email provider. The messages went back 14 years and they discussed, in the careful language of people who knew better than to be explicit, the management of what they called the long-term arrangement. 14 years. I sat with that number for a long time. In 2010, Richard was 61 and I was 58, and we were both still very much in command of the company. In 2010, Logan was 5 years old and Nathan and Vanessa had been married for 3 years. In 2010, Marcus Vane had been my financial officer for 3 years and had, as far as I had known, been doing the job I paid him to do with the competence I hired him for. 14 years of a long-term arrangement. I needed to know who D. Harlow was. I called Patricia into the study that evening, a Wednesday, 12 days after the funeral, and I showed her the emails. She read through them twice without speaking, the way she always read things, completely, before forming any response. D. Harlow, she said finally. I can't find a legal entity attached to that name in any of our vendor records, I said. But one of the 3 shell corporations, Harlow Meridian Logistics, that name appears in the transfer records. Patricia turned back to the second page of emails. This one from 2014, he says, the V situation is proceeding on schedule. N remains unaware. Timeline for full transfer is still flexible, but the foundation layer needs to be secure before we move to phase 2. She looked up at me. V and N. Vanessa and Nathan, I said. That's what I believe. N remains unaware, she repeated. Yes. We sat with that for a moment. The study was quiet except for the rain that had started against the windows. March in Charleston does this, warm enough to feel like almost spring, and then the rain comes in off the water and reminds you it isn't. So either Nathan is part of this, Patricia said carefully, or he isn't. And if he isn't, then Vanessa and Marcus were running something that involved Nathan's family without his knowledge, I finished. Or with his knowledge and his cooperation, and the line N remains unaware is misdirection. Or N is someone else entirely. I had considered that. I had gone back through the emails 3 times, looking for any context that would point N towards someone other than my son. I hadn't found it. But I also couldn't rule it out, and I knew that going into what came next with a wrong assumption about Nathan could be the kind of mistake I couldn't recover from. I needed certainty, and I didn't have it yet. I'm going to call a private investigator, I said. Someone I've used before. Not on company matters, personal ones. He's discreet. Patricia nodded. She had stopped looking surprised by things I said 2 days into her stay. I appreciated that about her. And Patricia, I said, Ed, the retirement fund transfers. What's the current balance compared to what it should be? She opened her laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet we'd been building, turned the screen toward me. I looked at the number. I had expected it to be bad. I had not expected it to be that bad. 743 employees, people who had worked for my company for decades, some of them. People who had been there before we had a proper accounting department, before we had more than 6 vessels and a leased warehouse, back when Richard and I were still doing payroll by hand on Sunday nights at the kitchen table. Their retirement savings had been systematically drained, not all at once, which would have triggered every alarm in the system, but slowly, carefully, in amounts calibrated to remain invisible. The current shortfall was $4,300,000. I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened them. All right, I said. Establish a complete parallel record of everything. Every transaction, every date, every account. I want 2 copies, one here and one off-site. Victor will hold the second. Done by morning, Patricia said. She said it simply, with no performance around it, and went back to work. I think that might be one of the things I have come to value most in the people I trust. They don't make a production of being reliable. They simply are. I sat at Richard's desk for a long time after she left the room. I looked at his photograph on the shelf. Not the formal one, the one from the sailing trip we took to the Outer Banks in 2003, where he was laughing at something off camera, sunburned across his nose, completely unguarded. I thought about what he would have said if I'd called him in that moment and told him what I had found. I thought he would have said, "Evelyn, you already know what to do. You've always known what to do. Just do it." He was right, of course, but knowing what to do and being willing to feel everything that doing it would cost were 2 different things. I picked up my phone and called Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross was 63, retired from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, and had worked as a private investigator for 11 years since. I had hired him twice before, once in 2015 to investigate a suspected insurance fraud in our cargo operations, and once in 2018 for reasons I have never discussed publicly and don't intend to start now. Both times he had been thorough, quiet, and exact. He charged what the work was worth, and he didn't embellish. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was the same as I remembered, unhurried, neither warm nor cold, the voice of someone who had spent decades keeping his own reactions off his face. I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Daniel. I didn't belabor it. I need your help with something. I need you to find out everything you can about a name, D. Harlow, possibly connected to a shell company called Harlow Meridian Logistics. I also need you to look into the professional background of Marcus Vane, specifically any associations or relationships that predate his employment with Whitmore Global, and I need you to be very quiet about it. A brief pause. How deep do you want me to go? As deep as the truth requires. Another pause, slightly longer. Timeline? As fast as you can move without making noise. I'll call you in a week, he said. Maybe sooner. He called me in 4 days. I was in the kitchen, eating a piece of toast that I hadn't wanted, but Patricia had put in front of me with the particular firmness of someone who has noticed that you've forgotten to eat again. When my phone rang, I excused myself and took it in the hallway. I found Dee Harlow, Daniel said. Tell me. Her full name is Dana Harlow. She's 54, currently living in Savannah. She ran a financial consulting firm called Harlow Advisory Group from 2001 to 2019, at which point the firm was dissolved and she transitioned into private wealth management. A pause. She and Marcus Vane attended the University of Georgia together, business school, same graduating class. I leaned against the hallway wall. They were close? I asked. Inseparable, according to people I talked to who knew them back then. There are photographs. They were together romantically for at least 2 years, possibly more. Nobody I spoke to was sure exactly when it ended. What's definitive is that they stayed in contact. He paused. Mrs. Whitmore, I found something else. Go ahead. Dana Harlow's financial consulting clients from 2009 to 2014. I pulled what I could from public filings and sourced the rest through some contacts. One of her clients during that period was a woman named Vanessa Cole. This was before she became Vanessa Whitmore. The hallway was very quiet. Before she married Nathan, I said. By approximately 4 years. I pressed my hand flat against the wall. Plaster, cool, slightly rough under my palm. Solid. Real. So Vanessa was Dana Harlow's client, and Dana Harlow was Marcus Vane's former partner. Correct. And Marcus Vane became my financial officer 3 years after Vanessa started working with Dana Harlow. Yes. I thought about that timeline. I had hired Marcus in 2007. Vanessa had married Nathan in 2008. Marcus and Dana Harlow, who were personally connected, who had been closely associated for decades, had been in a financial relationship with Vanessa for at least 3 years before either of them appeared in the orbit of my family. They knew each other first, I said. It wasn't a question. That's what the evidence suggests. The 3 of them were connected before any of them had a connection to Whitmore Global. Yes. I stood in my hallway for a long moment. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see Patricia's laptop open on the table, the blue light of spreadsheets reflected on the wall. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. "There's more," Daniel said. His voice had shifted in some way I couldn't quite name. A slight drop in register, the tone of someone about to say something they know is going to land hard. "About the grandson." My hand tightened on the phone. "Logan. Logan was in an accident 2 months ago. I found the hospital record. He was treated at MUSC for a fracture after a fall. Routine admission, routine blood work." He paused. The blood work included a standard panel that identified his blood type as AB negative. I knew enough to know where this was going, but I let him finish. AB negative, Daniel said carefully, would require that at least one biological parent carry either an A, B, or AB allele. Nathan's medical records, which I accessed through a source I won't detail, show him as type O positive. Vanessa's records show O positive as well. I closed my eyes. 2 O positive parents cannot produce an AB negative child, Daniel said. It's not possible genetically. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard since I sat beside Richard's bed and listened to the monitor go flat. 19 years. Logan was 19 years old. I had held him minutes after he was born. I had sat in the hospital room watching Nathan pace the corridor while Vanessa was in labor. And I had been the first person other than the medical staff to hold that child. And I had looked at his face, and I had felt something enormous and specific, the way you feel when a life begins right in front of you. 19 years of believing I was holding my husband's blood, his continuation, the next chapter of everything we had built. "Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel said quietly, "I'm here. Are you all right?" It was a strange question to answer honestly. "No," I said. "But go ahead." "I can't determine Logan's biological paternity from what I have. That would require a DNA test, but the implications—" "I understand the implications," I said. "There's one more thing I need to tell you." He took a breath. In my research into Vanessa's background, her life before Nathan, I found a sealed juvenile record from Fulton County, Georgia. I can't access the contents. But the record exists, and it was sealed in 1989, when she would have been approximately 17 years old. A juvenile record. Yes, I don't know what's in it, but it exists. All right. I pulled myself upright. My left knee hurt, my back hurt. I was 72 years old and I had been sleeping 4 hours a night for 2 weeks. And I had just learned that the grandson I loved was not biologically connected to my family. And that the woman who had spent 22 years inside my home might have entered it as part of a plan that was already years in motion before she ever shook my hand. "Daniel," I said, "I need you to keep going. Whatever else you can find, I need the complete picture." "Understood." He paused. "You need to be careful, Mrs. Whitmore. If these people are aware that someone is investigating—" "I've been careful my entire life," I said. "It's other people who haven't been careful enough." I hung up. I stood in the hallway for another minute. Then I walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and ate the rest of the toast. The call from Nathan came the next morning. I had wondered when it would. It had been 16 days since the funeral, and he had called twice, once on the day itself, once 3 days later. Both times brief, uncomfortable. The conversation of someone who has something they need to say and can't quite make themselves say it. I had let those calls run their course without pushing. I was waiting to see what he would do when Vanessa reported back that I hadn't signed the documents. Mom. His voice had that quality it got sometimes. Flat in the wrong way, pressurized, like he was managing something underneath it. Nathan. I heard from Vanessa that you wanted your attorney to look at things first. That's correct? I get it. I do, but I want you to understand that this isn't coming from a bad place. We're worried about you. The board. Nathan, I said. Which board members have you spoken to? A pause. Vanessa has been handling those conversations. You haven't personally spoken to any of them. There's been a lot going on with the estate and the transition of. Have you personally spoken to any board members about concerns regarding my leadership? The silence that followed lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know about that. No, he said finally. Not directly. I see. Mom? Nathan. I kept my voice very level because I had learned in 50 years of negotiation that calm is more frightening than anger to someone who is waiting for you to explode. I want you to understand something. I am not angry with you, but I'm paying very close attention to everything. Another silence. I heard him exhale, not in frustration, something closer to relief, which surprised me. It was the exhale of someone who has been holding their breath. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. That was all. We hung up. I sat with the sound of that exhale for a long time, because it had not sounded like the exhale of a guilty man who had been caught. It had sounded like the exhale of a frightened one. And those were not the same thing, not necessarily, but I wasn't ready to trust what I thought I heard. Not yet. The cost of being wrong in either direction was too high. I was still sitting with it when Patricia came into the kitchen with her laptop and her third cup of tea and a look on her face that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. The look of someone who has found something and is calculating how to present it. What is it? I asked. She set the laptop on the table and turned it toward me. The third shell corporation, the one we couldn't fully trace last week. Coastal Meridian Partners. What about it? I found the registered agent. She pointed at the screen. The name on the registration is Dana Harlow, but the signatory on the operating agreement, she pointed further down the page, is listed as V. Cole Whitmore. I looked at the name on the screen. Vanessa's signature on a fraudulent shell corporation used to drain my employees' retirement funds. I had known it was coming. The logic of everything Daniel had told me made it inevitable. But knowing something is coming and receiving the evidence of it are different experiences, and I sat with the difference for a moment. The gap between expecting a blow and feeling it land. Patricia, I said, how long would it take you to compile a complete dossier? Everything we have. The transaction records, the shell corporations, the transfer history, the signatory documents, everything. 48 hours, she said without hesitating. If I don't sleep. Don't sleep, I said. I'll get you better coffee. She almost smiled. Almost. There's something else. I waited. The operating agreement for Coastal Meridian. She scrolled down. The date of execution. I looked at the date, March 2019, 3.5 years ago. 8 months before Richard's health began declining in any visible, documented way, which meant that whenever these people had decided to begin the active phase of whatever they had been planning, they had not been waiting for Richard to get sick. They had been waiting for something else. Or they had simply decided the time had come. I pushed back from the table, walked to the window. The garden was starting to show the first suggestions of spring, pale green at the edges of things. The kind of early growth that looks tentative and is actually very determined. I thought about the phone call from Nathan, the exhale that sounded like a frightened man rather than a guilty one. And I thought about the email from 2010 that Daniel had found. N remains unaware. I didn't want it to be true that my son was a victim in this too. I also didn't want to allow that desire to compromise my thinking. I had seen enough people destroy their own cases by protecting someone who turned out not to deserve it. But the question of Nathan, of exactly what he knew and when he knew it, was not one I could afford to get wrong. I pulled out my phone, looked at his number, put the phone back down. Not yet. There was one more thing I needed to understand first. One piece of the structure that I still couldn't see clearly, because everything I had found told me how this had been done and who had done it. But there was a question underneath all of it that none of the financial records could answer. If Logan was not biologically Nathan and Vanessa's child, then whose child was he? And if someone had built an entire 19-year inheritance scheme around a false heir, what had they done with the original truth? I picked up my phone again, not to call Nathan, to call Daniel Cross. "I need you to look at something else," I said when he answered. "The period around Logan's birth. Everything you can find about Vanessa during that time, where she was, who she was in contact with, any medical records you can access. And Daniel," I paused, "I need to know if there was anyone else, any relationship, any name that appears around that time that doesn't fit the official picture." "That's going to take some time," he said. "I know. And it might take you somewhere you don't want to go." "I've already been somewhere I didn't want to go," I said. "I'm still standing." I heard him make a sound that might have been the closest thing to approval his voice could carry. "I'll be in touch." I set the phone down. Outside, a cardinal landed on the garden fence, red and sharp against the pale green, and sat there for a moment doing nothing in particular, and then it was gone. I went back to the desk and kept reading. On the 18th day after the funeral, Marcus Vane called my personal cell phone. It was evening. Patricia had gone upstairs, and I was sitting alone in the study, in the half-dark, not reading anything, just thinking. The call came in at 8:47 p.m., and I looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings before I answered. "Marcus." "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was the voice I had heard in 100 meetings, controlled, professional, slightly warm without being personal. "I apologize for calling at this hour. I wanted to check in on you personally. It's been almost 3 weeks since the service, and I realize I haven't done that adequately." "That's thoughtful of you," I said. "I also wanted to mention, and I hope this doesn't seem presumptuous, that the system access issue you may have encountered has been resolved. It was a routine security protocol update that had unintended effects on some legacy accounts. You should have full access now." I noted the specific phrasing, "should have full access," not "do have." Should. "I appreciate you letting me know," I said. "Of course. And please know," he paused, performing a beat of warmth, "that the entire team is here to support you through this transition, whatever you need." "Thank you, Marcus." "There is one other thing," he said, and here his tone shifted slightly. Subtle, the kind of shift only someone paying close attention would catch. "The quarterly review is coming up at the end of the month. The board will need some direction on how to proceed given the current circumstances. I just want you to be aware that there's no pressure, but there will need to be some clarity about the leadership structure before that meeting." "I understand," I said. "Of course." The warmth clicked back into place. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn." I was aware, as he said my first name, that it was the first time in 17 years he had used it in a one-on-one context. We had always been Mrs. Whitmore and Marcus in private. Evelyn was something different. It was the diminutive of a person who thinks they've already won. It was the familiarity of someone who no longer sees a need to observe the old boundaries because the old order is, in their estimation, already over. I hung up the phone, sat in the study in the near dark, and felt, for the first time since Vanessa walked into my living room with those documents on her knees, something shift in my chest. Not the cold, not the grief, but something harder and cleaner. Something that had been gathering in layers for 20 days now, building up behind everything I'd been feeling, and had finally resolved itself into a single thing I could name. I was not afraid of them. I had spent 20 days absorbing the evidence of what they had done and what they had planned. I had spent 20 days feeling the weight of it, the retirement funds, the false heir, the manufactured scheme, the careful architecture of a betrayal that had been in construction for 14 years. I had felt it. I had let myself feel all of it because that is what I believe you owe the truth, the full weight of your attention and your feeling, before you move to the part where you do something about it. Now I had felt it. Now it was time to do something about it. I turned on the desk lamp, pulled Richard's old leather notepad toward me, the one he kept for strategy sessions, the one with the Whitmore Global letterhead embossed on the cover. I opened it to the first blank page. I wrote one word at the top, evidence. Then I started writing everything I knew and everything I still needed and exactly what I intended to do about all of it. The boardroom was 31 days away. That was enough time. I had built a company from a handshake deal and a borrowed dock. I had restructured it through a cash flow crisis that should have killed it. I had run it for 48 years alongside a man I loved, and then for the last several alone in every way that mattered. 31 days was more than enough time to dismantle a scheme that, for all its careful construction, had made one fatal error. It had underestimated the person it was built to defeat. Daniel Cross called me on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 4 days after the funeral, while I was standing at the kitchen sink drinking coffee I had let go cold. "I found the name," he said. I set the mug down. "Tell me." "His name is Brett Calloway. He's 51, works in commercial real estate in Atlanta. Married, 2 kids, been in Georgia his whole life." A pause. "In 2003 and 2004, he and Vanessa were in a relationship. She was living in Atlanta at the time before she moved to Charleston. The relationship ended, from what I can piece together, sometime in late 2004, approximately 8 months before Logan was born." I stood very still at the sink. "I obtained a DNA comparison," Daniel said. "Don't ask me how. The markers are consistent with Logan being Brett Calloway's biological son." Outside my kitchen window, a neighbor was walking a dog down the sidewalk, and the dog was investigating something in the grass with the complete absorption of an animal that has no idea how strange the world can be. I watched it for a second because I needed something ordinary to look at. "Does Calloway know?" I asked. "No indication that he does. From everything I can find, he has had no contact with Vanessa since 2004. He appears to have no idea Logan exists." I thought about that. A man living his life in Atlanta, no idea he had a 19-year-old son being used as a pawn in an inheritance scheme in South Carolina. "And Vanessa," I said. "She's known this the entire time. She had to have. And Nathan," I stopped myself. "That I still can't determine with certainty," Daniel said. "The evidence I have doesn't tell me whether he knew about Logan's parentage. The 2010 email said N remains unaware, but that was 14 years ago, and people's knowledge of things changes." "I understand." I turned away from the window. "What about the sealed juvenile record?" "Still sealed. I have a contact who may be able to access the information through a secondary channel, but it's going to take more time. What I can tell you is that the record is from 1989, Fulton County, and it's categorized under financial offenses." "Financial offenses. At 17. "Yes." I thought about Vanessa sitting in my living room with that cream silk blouse and those pearl earrings and that practiced smile that never reached the outer corners of her eyes. And I thought about what it meant to be 17 years old and already building a particular kind of architecture around money and deception. Not excusing it. Just trying to understand the timeline of a person who had arrived in my family's life with a plan already in motion. "Daniel," I said, "I need you to find out one more thing. The board meeting is in 22 days. I need to know if Vanessa or Marcus have made any contact with board members directly, not through official channels, personally. Dinners, phone calls, anything that suggests they've been working the room." "I'll see what I can find," he said. "And Mrs. Whitmore, be careful. If they're monitoring your communications—" "They're not," I said. "I had Victor sweep the house last week." A pause. "You've done this before." "I've built things," I said, "that other people wanted, that teaches you to be careful about what you leave exposed." I hung up. Stood in the kitchen for a moment longer. Then I went to Richard's study, sat down, and added Brett Calloway's name to the notepad I had been building for 3 weeks. The picture was almost complete. Almost. Well, what I hadn't been prepared for. And I say this as someone who had spent the better part of a month preparing for almost everything, was the conversation with my son. It came about not because I sought it out, but because Nathan showed up at my door on a Thursday evening without calling first, which he had not done in years. I saw his car in the driveway through the front window, and I told Patricia quietly to take everything off the kitchen table and go upstairs, and I opened the door before he could ring the bell. He looked terrible. That was my first thought, and I am not going to soften it with better language than that. My son looked terrible. He had lost weight, which he couldn't afford to lose. Nathan had always been lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they're stressed. His eyes had that specific quality of someone who hasn't been sleeping. Not the heavy look of exhaustion, but the bright, hollowed-out look of a person whose mind refuses to go quiet. He was 44 years old and standing on my front porch, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "Can I come in?" he said. "Of course." I made coffee because my hands needed something to do and because the ritual of it, the filling of the kettle, the measuring, the ordinary mechanics of a familiar task, has a way of creating space in a room that you can't create with words. Nathan sat at this kitchen table, and I noticed he didn't take out his phone, which was unusual. He sat with his hands wrapped around the mug I gave him, and he looked at the table surface. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Wherever is true," I said. He looked up at me. His eyes were very tired. "I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for about 2 years. 2 years. I kept my face still. "Go ahead." "The documents Vanessa brought you—" He stopped, rubbed his hand across his jaw. "She told me she was going to do it. She said it was the right thing, that the company needed stable leadership going forward, that you'd been under too much strain with Dad's illness, and that—" He stopped again. "I didn't stop her." "I know you didn't." "I should have." "Yes." He flinched. I said it gently, but I said it directly, because I have never believed that softening the truth does anyone a service. He had not stopped her. He should have. Both of those things were true. "Mom." He set down the mug. "There are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you a long time ago, and I didn't, and I'm not going to make excuses for that. I just need you to hear them." "I'm listening, Nathan." He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator made a small sound. Somewhere upstairs, Patricia's chair shifted. "I've known for 2 years that something was wrong with the company finances," he said. "Not the details. I didn't know the specifics, but I started noticing things. Discrepancies that Marcus always had an explanation for. Vanessa knowing things about the financial structure that she shouldn't have had access to." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "And I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Marcus was competent, and that Vanessa was that she was just smart and involved and—" His voice cracked on the edge of the word, and he stopped. I waited. "I told myself those things," he said, "because the alternative was something I couldn't face." "What was the alternative?" He looked at me, and in his face, in the specific combination of exhaustion and shame and something that might have been the early, painful form of relief, I read the answer before he said it. "That I had spent 16 years building my life on something that wasn't real," he said. "That the woman I married had reasons for marrying me that had nothing to do with me, and that I had known it somewhere. I had always half known it, and I had chosen not to look directly at it because if I looked at it, I would have to do something about it, and I—" He stopped, shook his head. "I was a coward. I was afraid of losing everything, so I lost everything differently." The kitchen was very quiet. I looked at my son, my 44-year-old son who had been a gentle child and an uncertain teenager, and a man who had wanted, as far as I had always been able to tell, nothing more complicated than to be liked and to be comfortable and to believe that the people around him were what they presented themselves as. He had not been equipped for what had walked into his life. I don't know that many people would have been. That did not absolve him of the choices he had made, but it gave me a context I hadn't had before. "Nathan," I said carefully, "what do you know about Logan?" He went still. It was the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific question and has been dreading it. "Tell me what you know," I said. He put his hands over his face, sat like that for a moment. Then he lowered them, and when he looked at me, his eyes were wet. "I found out 3 years ago," he said. "I found a medical record, his blood work from a school sports physical." He stopped. "I'm O positive. Vanessa's O positive. I know enough basic biology to know what that means." "And you didn't tell me." "No." His voice was very flat. "I confronted Vanessa. We had the worst fight of our marriage. She admitted it. She wouldn't tell me who— She still won't tell me who Logan's father actually is. But she admitted that he wasn't biologically mine." "What did you do after that?" He laughed. A short, humorless sound. "Nothing. I did nothing." He shook his head. She told me that if I said anything, if I told anyone, if I contested it, then Logan would be devastated. That he had no idea. That he had grown up his whole life believing, and she wasn't wrong about that. Logan doesn't know. Whatever else Vanessa is, she's never told him. And the idea of Logan finding out, his voice broke for real this time. He's still my kid, Mom. I raised him. Whatever the biology says, I'm the one who taught him to drive and sat up with him when he had pneumonia at 9 years old and helped him study for his SATs. And Vanessa knew that. She knew that if she put Logan in front of me as the reason to be quiet, I would be quiet. She was right. I sat with everything he had said for a long moment. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with understanding someone you love clearly, not the comfortable version of them you've held in your mind, but the actual person, with all the fear and compromise and willful blindness that makes up a real human being rather than the simplified version. I was looking at my son, all of him, and what I felt was complicated enough that I knew better than to try to resolve it quickly. Nathan, I said, do you know about the retirement fund transfers? He frowned. What transfers? The employee retirement funds. Do you know about the shell corporations? Harlow Meridian? Coastal Meridian Partners? His frown deepened into something that looked genuinely confused. I don't know what those are. I watched his face. I have been reading faces for a very long time. He was not performing confusion. He was actually confused. All right, I said. Mom, what transfers? What retirement funds? He leaned forward. What's been happening? I'm going to tell you, I said. But first I need to ask you something. And I need a completely honest answer. Not the answer you think I want. Not the answer that's easiest. The truth. Okay. In the board meeting at the end of the month, when Vanessa expects me to sign those documents, whose side are you on? He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not have a clear answer. And then something in his face settled into a resolution that looked less like certainty and more like the beginning of it. The kind of choice that isn't easy and doesn't feel clean but is unmistakably the right one. Yours, he said. I should have been on your side from the beginning. I nodded. Then I need to show you something. I called downstairs to Patricia. Watching Nathan read through what Patricia and I had assembled over the past 3.5 weeks was one of the harder things I have done. Not because I felt sorry for him in a way that undermined my own position. I had moved past the point where his pain could compromise my clarity. But because there is something genuinely difficult about sitting across from your child, regardless of his age, and watching him understand document by document exactly how thoroughly the woman he had shared his life with for 22 years had constructed that life on a foundation of deliberate deception. He didn't speak for a long time. Patricia had gone back upstairs at my quiet signal. It was just the two of us in the kitchen, the documents spread across the table, and Nathan reading. When he got to the Shell Corporation registration with Vanessa's signature, he stopped. He put the paper down. He said very quietly, "She signed this." Yes. Her name is on a fraudulent shell corporation used to embezzle from the employee retirement fund. Yes. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. $8 million. He wasn't asking. He was reading the number from the summary document Patricia had prepared. She took $8 million from the people who worked for this company. The current confirmed shortfall in the retirement fund is $4.3 million, I said. The remainder moved through the shell structure in ways that Patricia is still tracing. These are people who have worked for Whitmore Global for 20, 30 years. His voice had changed. There was something in it that hadn't been there before. A hardness, not angry exactly, but the sound of someone arriving at the other side of a self-deception and finding what they find there. People who trusted this family. Yes. He sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling. Marcus has been in on this the whole time. Marcus and a woman named Dana Harlow. They were connected before either of them had any association with Whitmore Global. Before Vanessa married you. I let that settle. Nathan, Vanessa was Dana Harlow's financial advisory client for at least 3 years before you and Vanessa met. Marcus and Dana Harlow go back to business school together. He lowered his eyes from the ceiling and looked at me. They knew each other, I said. The three of them, before any of them were in this family's life. And Marcus joined the company 1 year after you and Vanessa started dating. The silence in the kitchen had a particular quality. I watched him do the math, not the financial math, the human math, the backward calculation of a timeline that recontextualized every memory he had of how his own life had unfolded. "She targeted me," he said. "The evidence suggests that was the intent from the beginning. Yes." He was quiet for a very long moment. I didn't try to fill it. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I'm going to the board meeting," I said, "and I'm going to give them what I have. Victor has already made preliminary contact with federal investigators. Not enough to move yet, not until I'm ready, but enough that when the moment comes, the support is there." "You've been building this for 3 weeks. 26 days. He shook his head slowly, not in judgment, in something closer to recognition. "You did all of this while they thought you were sitting here grieving and getting ready to sign." "I was grieving," I said. "Both things can be true." He looked at me across the table, across the documents, across the 26 days of evidence that I had built in the house that his father and I had shared for 30 years. And I watched something in him shift. Not a dramatic change, not the kind of transformation that fiction likes to portray, where a person becomes wholly different in a single moment. It was quieter than that. It was more like watching someone finally put down a weight they had been carrying for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "I want to help," he said. "I know." I paused. "There's one more thing I need from you, something I can't get from documents." "What is it?" "Vanessa cannot know that we've had this conversation. She cannot know that anything has changed between you and her. You need to go home tonight and behave exactly as you have been behaving. Can you do that?" He thought about it. I gave him the space to actually think about it rather than answer reflexively. "For how long?" 22 days. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I can do that. It will not be comfortable." "Mom," he said with a dry exhaustion in his voice, "nothing has been comfortable for 3 years. 22 more days is not the part that's going to break me." There was something in that, a bedrock practicality underneath all the pain, that reminded me briefly and sharply of Richard. Nathan left at 10:30. I watched his car back out of the driveway and turn down the street, and I stood at the window for a moment after his taillights disappeared, trying to hold the complicated truth of my son without either condemning him completely or excusing him entirely. He had been a coward. He had also been, in some significant way, a victim. Both of those things had happened, and how I moved forward had to account for both. I went back to the desk. 15 days until the board meeting. 15 days was enough. It had to be. The next call from Daniel Cross came 8 days later. I was upstairs, lying on top of the made bed in the dark, which was the closest I had come to resting in weeks. Not sleeping. My mind would not cooperate with sleep. But horizontal, in the dark, letting my body have a few hours of stillness, even if my thoughts wouldn't grant me the same. My phone lit up. I sat up and answered. "I accessed the record," Daniel said. His voice had a quality I recognized, the flat, deliberate tone of someone controlling their presentation of information because the information itself has a charge to it. "Tell me." In 1989, Vanessa Cole, then Vanessa Marie Pruitt, that was her name before she later changed it legally, was charged as a juvenile with fraud and identity theft. She had opened financial accounts in her grandmother's name without the grandmother's knowledge and used them to accumulate approximately $11,000 over an 18-month period. A pause. The grandmother did not press charges. The case was handled in juvenile court. The record was sealed. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. "She was 17, I said. "Yes. And she stole from her own grandmother. From financial accounts in her grandmother's name." He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're dealing with is not someone who developed a plan to defraud your family over the past decade. What you're dealing with is someone for whom this kind of behavior represents a pattern that goes back to her adolescence." I thought about that, about what it meant to be 17 years old and already capable of systematically stealing from an elderly woman who presumably trusted you. About what it meant that this same person had spent the next 3 decades refining those skills, finding more sophisticated partners, building more elaborate structures, and had ultimately arrived at my family, my company, my life's work, with the same fundamental architecture she had been practicing since she was a teenager. It was not the first time someone had targeted an older woman and her assets. It was just the largest and most patient attempt she had ever made. "Daniel," I said, "I need you to write up everything, all of it. Holloway's name, the juvenile record, everything. A complete investigative summary. Not for legal purposes. Victor has the legal documents. This is for me. I want the complete picture in one place. I can have it to you in 48 hours. Thank you." I paused. "And Daniel, after this is over, I don't know exactly what form over will take. I'm going to recommend you to every person I know who has need of your services." "Let's get you through the board meeting first," he said. He hung up. I sat in the dark for another few minutes. Then I got up, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the mirror for a moment with the unsentimental assessment of someone who knows exactly how tired they look and has no particular illusion to protect about it, and went back downstairs to the study. 7 days. The thing about building a counterattack over the span of a month, the thing no one who hasn't done it can fully understand, is that the hardest part is not the planning. The hardest part is the waiting. The planning keeps your mind occupied. It gives you tasks, milestones, the ongoing architecture of construction. But the waiting requires a different discipline entirely. The waiting requires you to appear to be doing nothing while being very precisely ready. I had always been better at doing than at appearing. The days between Daniel's final call and the board meeting were the longest of the month. Vanessa called twice. Pleasant, checking in, professionally warm, asking with the performed concern of someone who has everything under control, how I was holding up. I told her I was managing. I told her I was still reviewing the documents with Victor. I told her I appreciated her patience. She said all the right things in response. She was very good at saying all the right things. I thought about that sometimes. About how many years I had spent in the same room with this woman at family dinners and holidays and company events and occasional quiet Sunday afternoons when she and Nathan would come for lunch, and how I had registered something slightly off about her without ever being able to name it precisely. Not anything dramatic, just the small, consistent quality of someone whose warmth never quite synchronized with whatever was actually happening in their eyes. I had put it down to personality. Some people are simply warmer in manner than in nature, and that is not a crime. It took me a long time and a great deal of evidence to name what I had actually been sensing all those years. She was always performing. There was no version of Vanessa that wasn't performing for an audience. Even alone, I suspected even alone, she would not have known how to simply be. Marcus called once, in the week before the meeting, to confirm the logistics. The board meeting was scheduled for a Monday. He was businesslike, efficient, and entirely too relaxed. That was the tell, actually. A genuinely competent financial officer, in the weeks following the death of a company's co-founder, would have been running slightly hot with the genuine demands of the situation. Marcus was composed in a way that only made sense if he didn't believe the meeting held any real uncertainty. He thought it was already over. He thought they were walking into a formality. I let him think that. The Sunday night before the board meeting, Victor came to the house. Patricia joined us. The three of us sat in Richard's study, the same desk, the same chairs, the same lamp, and went through everything one final time. Every document, every sequence, every name, every date. Victor had coordinated with federal investigators who would be present but not visible until the appropriate moment. Patricia had prepared 3 complete copies of the evidence package, each stored separately. We went through it all, and then Victor closed his notebook, and we sat for a moment in the quiet. "You're sure about this?" Victor asked. He asked it the way a good attorney asks it, not as doubt, not as caution, but as the final verification of a plan from someone who knows the plan is sound, but wants to hear the person executing it confirm their own certainty. "I have been sure," I said, "since the night I sat in this room and read the first email." He nodded. "Then we're ready." Patricia, who had said almost nothing for the last hour, looked up from her copy of the evidence package. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've never seen a more complete case built from a standing start in less than 5 weeks. They are not going to see this coming." "No," I agreed. "They're not." I walked them both out at 11 o'clock. Stood in the driveway for a moment after their cars left. The night was mild. It was April now, fully spring, and the air had that quality of the low country in spring, dense with green, salt underneath it, the particular smell of a coast that has been here longer than anything built on top of it. I thought about Richard, not in grief, not in that moment, just in the simple fact of him, the reality of 48 years of a person who had been as much a part of my architecture as any structure I had ever built. I thought about what he had said in the last clear conversation we had before the illness took his clarity from him, sitting in the garden on a September afternoon with the light coming through the oak trees the way it does in late September in Charleston. He had taken my hand and looked at me with the specific directness of someone who is choosing to say something they might not get another chance to say. "You were always the stronger one," he said. "I was just the one who knew how to talk about it." I had laughed at the time because it was the kind of thing Richard said. True, and slightly too honest and laced with the particular love of a person who has known you long enough to stop flattering you and start simply seeing you. I had not understood on that September afternoon that I would need to remember it. I understood now. I went inside, set my alarm for 6 o'clock, lay down on top of the made bed again, not expecting sleep, just giving myself the possibility of it. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, I actually slept. And at 7:45 the next morning, I put on the charcoal gray suit I had worn to the company's 30th anniversary celebration, Richard's choice. He had said it made me look like someone who had already won whatever she was about to walk into. And I drove myself to the building that had my name on it. I was not early, and I was not late. I walked through the front doors at exactly 8 o'clock, nodded to the security desk, and took the elevator to the executive floor. Vanessa was already in the boardroom. She was sitting in my chair. I walked in, and she looked up, and the smile that crossed her face was the practiced one, the one that never reached the outer corners of her eyes. "Evelyn," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you decided to come." I sat down across from her. I placed my hands flat on the table. I looked at her steadily, and I did not smile back because I have spent a lifetime not performing things I don't feel, and what I felt in that moment was not warmth. "Let's begin," I said. The boardroom at Whitmore Global Shipping occupied the entire northeast corner of the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the harbor. Richard had designed it that way deliberately. He wanted every meeting to happen in sight of the water, in sight of the vessels and the docks, and the actual physical reality of what the company did. He said it kept people honest, reminded them that the numbers on the spreadsheets corresponded to real things happening in the real world. I had always loved that room. Standing in the doorway of it now, watching Vanessa sit in my chair at the head of the table with the harbor behind her and the morning light coming in hard off the water, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not even the cold clarity I had been carrying for 5 weeks. What I felt, briefly and specifically, was grief. Not for myself, for the room, for what it had been built to mean and what was sitting in it. There were 9 board members present. They were arranged around the long mahogany table with the careful, slightly uncertain posture of people who have been told what this meeting is about and are not entirely sure they're comfortable with it. I knew all of them, some for decades. James Alderton, 70, who had served on the board since 2001. Carol Prestwick, 66, who had been Richard's choice for the audit committee. 4 others who had been with us for more than 15 years. And 3 newer members, appointed in the past 4 years, whose names I knew, but whose loyalties I had spent the past week quietly mapping with Victor's help. Marcus was standing near the credenza along the left wall, beside a younger man from the legal department named Forsyth, who I had met twice and found unremarkable. Marcus was dressed precisely, as always. He gave me a nod when I entered, measured, professional, pitched to communicate sympathy without conceding anything. I nodded back. Nathan was already seated at the far end of the table, to the left, away from where Vanessa had positioned herself. He had followed my instructions exactly. He had come in, taken a peripheral seat, and made himself architecturally smaller than his wife expected him to be. When I entered, he looked up and met my eyes for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at the table. That was all we needed. Vanessa rose when I came in. The practiced warmth, the cream blouse again. Different one, same color, same message. The smile that I now read as fluently as a second language. "Evelyn, I'm so glad you're here. Please, sit down." She gestured toward the chair to her right. The second chair. The visitor's position. I looked at her. Then I walked to the head of the table and stood beside my chair. The chair she was no longer in, having stood to greet me. and I pulled it out and sat down. There was a brief silence. Vanessa's smile held, barely. She sat back down to my right, which placed her in the position she had intended for me. I noted that she adapted quickly, without letting the reorganization register on her face, which told me again what I already knew. She was very good at this. She had been very good at this for a very long time. "Before we begin," she said, addressing the room, "I want to thank everyone for coming on short notice. As you all know, we're here to discuss the leadership transition at Whitmore Global, and specifically to finalize the documentation that will—" "I'd like to say something first," I said. Heads turned. Vanessa's eyes settled on me with the specific quality of a person recalibrating. "Of course," she said. I looked around the table. 9 board members, some of whom I had known for 20 years, all of whom were watching me with varying degrees of uncertainty. I took a breath. Not for calm, I was already calm, but because I wanted to be deliberate. I wanted every word to land where it was aimed. "I want to thank you all for your service to this company," I said. "Many of you have been part of Whitmore Global for a very long time, and your investment in this institution has meant a great deal to me and to Richard. I also want to say plainly that I know some of you have been approached in recent weeks with information or suggestions about the future of this company's leadership, and I want you to know that I understand the position that put you in." A small shift around the table. James Alderton looked down at his hands. Carol Prestwick met my eyes. "What I'm going to share with you this morning," I continued, "is going to change the nature of this meeting. I want to apologize in advance for the difficulty of what you're about to hear, but I believe you have the right to know the truth about what has been happening inside this company before you make any decisions about its future." Vanessa's voice came in smooth and immediate. "Evelyn, I think what everyone needs this morning is a clear path forward, and I don't want us to get sidetracked by—" "Vanessa!" I looked at her directly. "I'll only be a few minutes." Something moved behind her eyes. The recalibration again, but faster this time, and with something underneath it that I had not seen there before. Something that might, if I were being precise, be described as the first faint evidence of alarm. "Of course," she said. I nodded to Victor, who was seated along the wall behind me, not at the table, deliberately, so that his entrance into the proceedings would be a choice rather than an assumption. He stood and placed 3 bound document packages on the table in front of me. One for me, one that would be distributed, and one that would go directly to the investigators when the moment came. I opened the first package. "What I'm going to present," I said, "is a financial audit conducted over the past 5 weeks by a certified forensic accountant retained independently by me. Her name is Patricia Huang, and her credentials are documented in the appendix. The audit covers Whitmore Global's financial records from January 2021 through the present, with specific focus on transaction flows involving 3 entities: Harlow Meridian Logistics, Coastal Meridian Partners, and a third corporation registered under the name Vane Stratton Consulting." Marcus Vane, at the credenza, did not move, but something in his stillness changed quality. "Over the course of 22 months," I said, "funds totaling $8,400,000 were transferred from Whitmore Global operating accounts through these 3 shell entities. These transfers were executed in amounts calibrated to remain below automatic audit thresholds. The destination of the transferred funds was, in substantial part, the company's employee retirement trust, which was then systematically drawn down through a secondary transfer structure." I paused. "The current shortfall in the employee retirement fund is $4,300,000. 743 current and former employees are affected." The silence in the room was total. Carol Prestwick had gone very still. James Alderton's jaw had tightened. Around the table, I could see people doing what people do when they receive information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about a situation. They go quiet, and they look at things that aren't there. Vanessa said, quietly and with remarkable steadiness, "Those are very serious allegations, Evelyn. I hope you understand that making unsubstantiated claims in front of the board, they are substantiated," I said, "comprehensively. The documentation is in the package that Victor is now distributing." I nodded to Victor, who began placing copies in front of each board member. Page 12 shows the transaction record for the first series of transfers. Page 27 shows the Shell Corporation registrations. Page 31 shows the signatory documentation for Coastal Meridian Partners. Vanessa reached for the package when Victor placed it in front of her. She opened it. I watched her find page 31. I watched her face when she read her own name. She was good. She was very, very good. Her expression did not collapse. There was no dramatic moment of visible panic. What happened was subtler and in some ways more telling, a slight controlled stillness, like a person who has just stepped onto ice of uncertain thickness and is assessing, very quickly, whether it will hold. "This is a forgery," she said. Her voice was level. "My signature was used without my knowledge or consent. I've never had any involvement with these entities." "Your signature appears on the operating agreement dated March 2019, I said. "A handwriting analysis is included in the appendix, page 84. "A handwriting analysis can be challenged." "It can," I agreed. "You're also welcome to challenge the phone records on page 67, which document 63 calls between your personal cell phone and Dana Harlow's registered number between 2019 and 2023. Or the financial records on page 72, showing that Dana Harlow's Savannah account received transfers from Harlow Meridian Logistics, one of the entities through which company funds were routed, totaling $940,000. I kept my voice even. Dana Harlow, for the record, is documented on page 8 as a former business associate and personal acquaintance of Marcus Vane, with a professional relationship to you predating your marriage to Nathan by approximately 4 years. The room was so quiet I could hear the harbor through the glass. Vanessa set the document package down. She set it down with the careful precision of someone who is making sure their hands don't shake, and I watched her make sure her hands didn't shake, and I thought, there it is. That is the first true thing I have seen from you in 22 years. She looked at Marcus. It was a fast look, involuntary, the kind you can't entirely suppress. A split-second check of another person when your shared strategy requires rapid reassessment. Marcus received the look without returning it, which told me something about the hierarchy of whatever they had between them. When the pressure came, Marcus was going to save himself first. I filed that away. "Marcus," I said, turning to him directly for the first time. "The documentation on page 42 covers your administrative access to the retirement fund transfer system. The transaction logs on pages 43 through 51 document your execution of 47 separate transfers over 22 months. The Shell Corporation registrations show your name as the organizing agent for Vane Stratton Consulting." I paused. "Do you want to tell the board that those are forgeries as well?" Marcus looked at me. In 17 years, I had never seen him look the way he looked at that moment. Not afraid exactly, because Marcus Vane was the kind of man whose primary relationship with fear was to convert it immediately into calculation. What I saw was calculation in full, visible operation. His mind working through the inventory of what I had and what it meant, and what, if anything, could still be managed. He said nothing, which was, I suppose, the first honest response he had given me in 17 years. James Alderton spoke from his end of the table, his voice careful and slow. "Evelyn, this is substantial. Are you saying these transfers were actively concealed from the audit committee?" "The audit committee's access was limited to the primary accounting system," I said. "The transfers were executed through a secondary administrative layer that was not visible in the standard audit view. The parallel system I maintain, which is documented in the technical appendix, captured the complete transaction record." "A parallel system," Carol Presswick said. "You've been maintaining a parallel financial record?" "Since 2004, I said. "After a ransomware incident that year, I built a backup architecture that runs independently of the main system. It was a precaution. No one at the company was informed of its existence because the value of a security backup depends on it not being known to potential bad actors." I looked around the table. "That decision, which I made 20 years ago out of basic operational caution, is the reason we are able to document everything that happened." Alderton looked at Marcus, then at Vanessa, then back at the document in front of him. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to adjourn the original agenda of this meeting." "I agree," Carol said immediately. Vanessa put both palms flat on the table. "Before anyone makes any decisions based on unverified—" "The documents are verified," Victor said from behind me, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who has been quiet for the right amount of time. "My firm has reviewed the complete evidentiary package. I have also been in contact with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who have reviewed a preliminary summary. He paused. There are investigators present in this building this morning. They've been waiting for the appropriate moment. The silence that followed that sentence had a different quality from all the previous silences. It was the silence of people who have just understood that the meeting they came to is not the meeting they are in. Vanessa stood up. It was a fast movement, not panic, still controlled, but the speed of someone who has run the calculations and reached a conclusion about what action is available. "I need to speak with my attorney," she said. "You're welcome to call your attorney," Victor said pleasantly. "However, I'd advise you to remain in the room. The investigators would prefer to conduct their initial conversation here. I am not under any obligation to—" The door opened. 2 men and a woman entered. Not in uniform, plain clothes, the specific kind of unremarkable professional appearance that federal investigators cultivate. The woman in front showed credentials to the room generally, not theatrically, just efficiently. "Good morning. We're going to ask everyone to remain seated for a few minutes while we speak with a few individuals. This will be brief." Vanessa sat back down. She sat back down because there was nothing else to do, and she was too intelligent not to know it. And for the first time since she had walked into my living room 7 weeks ago with those documents on her knees and that practiced smile on her face, for the first time the performance dropped. Not entirely, never entirely, with someone like Vanessa, but enough that what was underneath it was briefly, uncomfortably visible. The exhaustion of someone who has been maintaining a very elaborate structure for a very long time and has just watched it come down. I looked at her across the table and I felt, not satisfaction, which would have been too simple, not triumph. What I felt was something closer to sorrow. The specific sorrow of witnessing the scale of what had been wasted. Not just the money, not just the theft, but the years, the capacity. Whatever intelligence and discipline had gone into building something this intricate over this long a period of time, directed entirely toward destruction rather than creation. What a waste, I thought. What an extraordinary, complete waste of a life. Marcus was spoken to first. He walked to the far end of the room with the investigator, and I watched him go, and what I noted was that he didn't look at Vanessa again. Not once. Whatever the structure of their partnership had been, the termination of it was immediate and clean on his side. Nathan had not moved from his position at the far end of the table. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes down, and when I looked at him across the room, he looked up. And what I saw in his face was not relief, and it was not vindication, and it was not any of the emotions that the situation, from a distance, might seem to call for. What I saw was grief. The specific grief of someone watching the life they built, however imperfectly, however compromised, disassemble itself in real time. I understood that. I did not try to resolve it with a look. James Alderton came to my end of the table while the investigators were speaking with Marcus. He sat in the chair beside me and lowered his voice. "Evelyn, are you all right?" "I'm functional," I said. Thank you for asking." "This is—" He shook his head. "I can't quite—" "I know," I said. "I had 5 weeks to adjust to it. Give yourself some time." He looked at the document package in front of him. "The retirement fund. $4,300,000. "Yes." "Those are people who gave this company their working lives," I said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Can it be restored?" "That is my primary intention," I said, "before anything else." He nodded. He was 70 years old and he had been on this board for 23 years, and he was looking at me with an expression that combined respect and something I could only describe as a complicated relief. The relief of someone who had been uncertain about the stability of something they valued and has just been shown that the foundation is still solid. "Good," he said simply. "I'm glad it's you who's still here." He went back to his seat. Across the room, Vanessa was speaking with one of the investigators in a low, controlled voice. I could not hear what she was saying, but I could read the posture. Still upright, still composed, still performing the version of herself that was capable and cooperative and had nothing to hide. Even now, even in this room, in this moment, with her signature on a document 31 pages into a forensic audit. Some people never stop performing. It's not calculation anymore by a certain point. It's just the only thing they know how to do. The investigator speaking to her said something, and Vanessa's posture shifted, just slightly, just enough. And I watched her reach for her phone and begin to dial a number, and I knew she was calling the attorney she had mentioned, the one she had presumably retained for exactly this kind of contingency. She had planned for this too, in the way of someone who knew what they were doing was wrong and had made arrangements accordingly. Planning for the possibility of being caught was not the same as being innocent. The board members were gathering their things, speaking in low voices. Carol Prestwick stopped beside me on her way toward the door, where an investigator was managing who left and when. "The audit committee is going to need to meet as soon as possible," she said quietly. "I'll have Victor coordinate with you this week," I said. She put her hand briefly on my arm. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The room emptied gradually, in the careful, ordered way that rooms empty when federal investigators are managing the exit. I stayed in my chair at the head of the table. I didn't feel the need to move. This was my room, my building, and I had been here since 8 o'clock that morning, and I intended to remain here until I was ready to go. Nathan was the last board member left in the room besides me. He came toward me slowly, with the particular movement of someone who isn't sure of their reception and has decided to present themselves honestly rather than strategically. He stood beside my chair. "Is it done?" he asked. "The beginning of it is," I said. "The legal process will take time, but the immediate threat to the company, yes, that's done." He nodded, looked at the window, at the harbor, at the water that Richard had wanted visible from every meeting in this room. "What happens now?" "Now the investigators do their work," I said. "Now the board stabilizes. Now we restore what was taken from the employees." I looked up at him. "And now you and I have a longer conversation than the one we had at the kitchen table, but not today. Today has been enough." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Today has been enough." He left. I sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes. Victor came back in at some point and stood near the door without interrupting. He knew when I needed space. Patricia, who had been waiting in the lobby per my instructions, sent a text that simply read, "Done?" I texted back, "Done." She sent back a single word, "Good." I looked out at the harbor. A container vessel was moving slowly through the shipping channel, making for the open water. One of ours, by the markings, though I couldn't read the name at this distance. Just the shape of it, heavy and deliberate, cutting through the water toward wherever it was going. I thought about Richard. I thought about the borrowed dock in 1976, the Sunday nights doing payroll by hand, the cash flow crisis of 1987, the 48 years of building something that was worth the kind of attention that people like Vanessa Cole had given it, worth it to steal, which meant it had been worth it to fight for. I gathered my copy of the evidence package, capped my pen, and pushed back from the chair. My left knee protested, as it always did after long periods of sitting. I stood up slowly, with the unsentimental acknowledgement of a body that had been carrying a 72-year-old life through 5 weeks of very little sleep and very high stakes, and I straightened my jacket, and I picked up my bag. Victor was at my elbow. "Car?" "In a minute," I said. "I want to walk through the building first." He understood. He stayed at the elevator while I walked the 14th floor, past the offices, past the glass-walled conference rooms where I could see people working at their desks, past the framed photographs in the corridor, the first vessel, the Charleston dock in the early years, the international expansion, the 30th anniversary. The history of a company that 2 people had built from an idea and a willingness to work harder than anyone expected them to. At the end of the corridor, there was a window that looked south, over the city rather than the harbor. I stood there for a moment and looked at the view. The rooftops, the church spires, the distant glint of water on 3 sides. Because Charleston is a city that the ocean surrounds on 3 sides and reminds you of that constantly. 50 years ago, Richard and I had stood on a dock in this city with nothing but a plan in each other, and we had built something. We had built it imperfectly and with great difficulty and at considerable personal cost, and with 1,000 decisions that looked nothing like the clean narratives people prefer to tell about how empires are made. They had tried to take it. They had failed. Not because I was extraordinary, not because I had some gift that other people lacked, but because I had paid attention, because I had built a backup system 20 years ago out of basic caution, because I had trusted the right people with the right things and kept my own counsel about the rest, because I had loved this company, not sentimentally, not abstractly, but in the specific, daily, unglamorous way of someone who had actually built it with their hands, their years, their sleepless nights, their willingness to do the work when the work was hard. You cannot love something that way and then simply surrender it. Yet I had not surrendered it. I turned away from the window and walked back to the elevator, where Victor was waiting, where the rest of the work was waiting, where a company of 743 employees and their retirement savings and their futures and their trust was waiting to be made whole. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. "All right," I said to Victor, "let's go to work." The weeks that followed the board meeting were not clean. That is the first thing to understand about what happened after. That real consequences, when they finally arrive, do not arrive in the neat and finished way that justice looks like from a distance. They arrive in pieces, over time, with paperwork and delays and setbacks and moments where the machinery of accountability moves so slowly that the people waiting on it begin to doubt that it is moving at all. Evelyn understood this. She had been in business long enough to know that the distance between a decision and its outcome is always longer and more complicated than anyone wants it to be. She had known it going in. That knowledge did not make the waiting easy, but it kept her from being surprised by it, which is perhaps the most a person can ask of their own experience. The federal investigation into Marcus Vane and Vanessa Whitmore was formally opened within 2 weeks of the board meeting. The FBI Financial Crimes Division, the same agents who had been present in the boardroom that Monday morning, worked with the forensic documentation that Patricia Huang had spent 5 sleepless weeks assembling. And what they found when they expanded the scope of the investigation beyond what Evelyn had been able to access confirmed everything she had built and then went further. Dana Harlow, reached by investigators at her Savannah home on a Thursday afternoon, made what her attorney later described as a cooperative decision. She provided documentation. She provided communication records. She provided, in the end, the kind of testimony that prosecutors find useful and that former partners find unforgivable. The testimony of someone who has calculated that cooperation is preferable to solidarity and has acted accordingly. Marcus Vane retained a defense attorney within 48 hours of the board meeting and said nothing useful to anyone for 3 months. His attorney filed preliminary motions, challenged the admissibility of several pieces of evidence, and mounted the kind of procedural defense that buys time rather than innocence. In the end, it bought him approximately 4 months and reduced his exposure marginally. He pleaded guilty to 14 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial crimes. His sentencing was set for the following spring. Vanessa fought longer. That was not surprising. Evelyn had never expected Vanessa to surrender easily, and in some complicated corner of her mind she had respected the consistency of it. The woman had been fighting, in one form or another, since she was 17 years old in a Fulton County courtroom, and the patterns of a lifetime do not dissolve because circumstances have become unfavorable. Vanessa's attorney filed challenges, issued statements, and pursued the strategy of someone who believes that if you generate enough noise, you can obscure the signal. The signal, in this case, was her signature on a fraudulent corporate document and 63 phone calls to a co-conspirator and a financial trail that Patricia Huang had documented with a precision that did not leave room for reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Evelyn did not attend the verdict. She had given her testimony in a federal courtroom 6 weeks before the verdict came in, 3 hours on the stand, measured and specific, addressing the jury with the direct clarity of someone who has spent 50 years saying exactly what she means. Her attorney had prepared her for aggressive cross-examination. The cross-examination, when it came, was aggressive. Evelyn answered every question in the same register, even, factual, unhurried. She did not perform distress. She did not perform triumph. She told the truth about what she had found and how she had found it and what it meant, and then she stepped down and went back to work. Vanessa was convicted on 11 of the 14 counts brought against her: financial fraud, conspiracy, and 2 counts related to the structured manipulation of the Employee Retirement Fund. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Her attorney announced plans to appeal. Evelyn read the verdict on her phone in her office, between a call with the company's new financial officer, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had come highly recommended by 3 people Evelyn trusted, and who had the specific quality of competence that presents itself without performance, and a meeting with the Retirement Fund Restoration Committee. She read it twice, set the phone down, looked out the window at the harbor for 30 seconds, then picked the phone back up and called Victor. "I saw," he said when he answered. Good, she said. Now, let's talk about the restoration timeline. That was how she handled it. Not with ceremony, not with the dramatic exhale of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive. Just, it's done. Now what's next? There was always something next. That had always been true, and she had always preferred it that way. The restoration of the Employee Retirement Fund took 8 months from start to completion, which was 3 months longer than Evelyn had initially projected, and 2 months shorter than the legal team had feared. The gap between the projected and the actual shortfall turned out to be larger than Patricia's initial estimate, $5,100,000 in total, once every transfer had been fully traced and accounted for. The additional $800,000 came from a secondary structure that Dana Harlow's testimony revealed, a layer that had been established specifically to capture a portion of funds in transit between the shell corporations. Evelyn covered the full restoration personally. There was a debate about this. Victor argued that the company should bear the cost, that a personal contribution of that magnitude was not necessary and potentially complicated the legal recovery process. Patricia pointed out, practically, that the company's liquidity had been affected by the investigation period and that a personal infusion would actually accelerate the timeline for employees. The two of them had a 30-minute discussion in Evelyn's office about the relative merits of various approaches, conducted with the professional precision of people who disagree about something that matters. Evelyn listened to both of them. Then she said, "These are my employees. The company I built took their money. I'm going to give it back." She said it with the flatness of a person who has made a decision and does not require consensus. Victor and Patricia exchanged a look that contained in approximately equal measure respect and the acknowledgement that further argument was not productive. The restoration was processed through a dedicated fund established specifically for the purpose. Every employee who had been affected received a letter. Not a form letter, not a template with names inserted by a program, but a letter that Evelyn wrote herself over the course of 2 evenings at Richard's desk, reworked 7 times before she was satisfied with it. The letter explained what had happened, what had been done to address it, and what the restored balance in their accounts would reflect. It did not ask for forgiveness. It did not offer explanations that functioned as excuses. It stated the facts and accepted the responsibility, and at the bottom it carried her signature in the same handwriting she had used for 50 years. She received 41 responses. Some of them were one line. Some of them were several pages. A retired freight coordinator named Gerald Owens, who had worked for the company for 31 years, wrote 4 paragraphs about what it had meant to him to receive the letter, and Evelyn read it at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning and then sat quietly for several minutes before folding it and placing it in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. She did not respond to any of the letters publicly. She called Gerald Owens personally on a Tuesday afternoon, and they talked for 45 minutes about the company's early years, which he remembered in specific and fond detail, and about his grandchildren, and about the particular quality of light on the harbor, in the early morning when a vessel is coming in from a long run, and the whole waterfront smells of salt and diesel, and something that doesn't have a name, but that everyone who has ever worked on the water knows immediately. When they hung up, Gerald said he hoped she would take care of herself. She told him she was working on it. That was more honest than he probably realized. The taking care of herself part was, in fact, the most difficult of all the things she was managing. The investigation period had cost her. She had not slept properly in 5 weeks, had not eaten properly in more than that, had operated at a sustained level of concentration and controlled stress that her body had tolerated in the short term, and was now, in the less urgent aftermath, beginning to present the invoice for. Her doctor, a blunt woman named Dr. Chen, who had been her physician for 14 years and had no patience for evasion, told her at her first post-board meeting appointment that her blood pressure was elevated, that she had lost 11 pounds she could not afford to lose, and that continuing at the pace she had been maintaining was not a negotiable long-term strategy. "I know," Evelyn said. "You know," Dr. Chen repeated, with the tone of a woman who has heard this before from this particular patient. "And what are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to take 2 weeks," Evelyn said, "after the retirement restoration is processed." 2 weeks, Dr. Chen said. "It's what I can manage right now." Dr. Chen made a note in the chart and gave Evelyn a look that communicated, without requiring elaboration, that the doctor's opinion of this plan was not high. 2 weeks is a start," she said. Emphasis on start. Evelyn took the 2 weeks. She went to the house on Pawleys Island that she and Richard had owned for 20 years and used perhaps twice as often as they should have. A shingled house 3 lots from the water, with a porch that faced west and a garden that had gone somewhat wild from inattention. She brought 2 books she had been meaning to read for years, and a pair of walking shoes and her phone, which she checked twice a day and tried not to think about at the other times. She walked in the morning, she sat on the porch in the afternoon. She slept 8 hours most nights, which she had not done in longer than she could clearly remember. She was not peaceful in the way that vacation photographs would suggest peace looks. She was still working, in her mind, constantly, turning over decisions and timelines and the ongoing architecture of what came next for the company, for the foundation she was planning, for Nathan, for Logan. Her mind was not built for stillness, and she had stopped expecting it to be. But her body rested, and that mattered. Nathan called her on the 4th day. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the light change over the marsh to the west, when her phone rang. She answered without checking the screen and heard his voice. "How's Pawleys?" he said. "Quiet," she said. "How are you?" "Getting there." A pause. "I wanted to let you know. I filed the divorce papers this morning." She had known it was coming, had expected it for weeks since the board meeting, since the long conversation they had eventually had in her kitchen. The longer one she had promised him, the one that took 3.5 hours and covered things that had needed to be said between them for years. Uncomfortable things, honest things, the kind of conversation that can only happen when there is no longer any reason to protect anyone from the truth. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yeah." His voice had the flat quality of someone who is telling the truth about something that hurts. "I don't know what all right is going to look like yet, but I'm not all right, if that makes sense." "It makes sense." "Logan wants to talk to you," he said. Not about the paternity thing. He doesn't know yet. I haven't figured out how to... I don't know when the right time is for that conversation." "There may not be a right time," Evelyn said. "There may only be a time." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right about that." Another pause. "He just wants to see you. This has been hard for him without really knowing what's happening. He knows something is wrong, obviously. He's not a kid, but he doesn't know the scope of it." "Tell him to call me," she said. "Or come here if he wants. The guest room is available." "Yeah?" "I mean it, Nathan. Whatever else has happened, Logan is still..." She stopped, looked out at the marsh. A heron was standing in the shallows with the complete motionlessness of a creature that is being patient about something it is very certain of. "He's still my grandson," she said. "Biology doesn't change what 20 years of Sunday dinners means." Nathan made a sound she couldn't quite categorize, something between relief and grief, which was, she supposed, what most real emotions are made of. They talked for another 20 minutes about less consequential things: the company, the board's recovery, a minor operational issue Sandra Okafor had flagged that Nathan was helping to address. When they hung up, Evelyn sat for a long time looking at the marsh and thinking about Logan. Logan came 2 days later, alone, driving himself down from Charleston in the late afternoon. He was 19 years old, and he looked, in the unsettling way of young men who resemble people you have loved, like Nathan at the same age. The same slightly uncertain way of occupying space. The same reflex of looking for approval before deciding how to feel about a situation. He had his father's eyes and his mother's jawline, and a laugh that was entirely his own, which Evelyn had always found, privately, to be one of the most reassuring things about him. She fed him dinner because he was visibly thin in the way of college students who live primarily on convenience and forget that food is not optional. And they sat on the porch afterward while it got dark, and he talked. He talked the way young people talk when they have been frightened by something they don't fully understand and are in the presence of someone they trust enough to let the fear out. Circling, not quite direct, touching the edges of what was wrong without being able to name the center of it. He talked about feeling like something had been hidden from him, about the way his father had been different in the past few years, distant in a way Logan couldn't put a name to, about his mother's absence now, which he understood abstractly through what he had been told but could not yet fully feel, because that kind of loss takes time to arrive in its full weight. Evelyn listened. She did not try to resolve what he said into something more comfortable. She let him talk until he ran out of things to say, And then she looked at him in the near dark of the porch and said, "You are going to have some hard things to understand in the coming months. Not tonight. Tonight you don't need to understand anything. But I want you to know that whatever you find out, whatever gets explained to you, I will be here. I have always been here, and none of what has happened changes the fact that I love you." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Even if things are different than we thought," he said. "Especially then," she said. "That's exactly when it counts." He didn't say anything else about it. He helped her with the dinner dishes because she asked him to, and then they watched a film, an old one, a Western that Richard had loved and that Evelyn tolerated with mild affection. And he fell asleep on the couch before it ended, the way he had been falling asleep on her furniture since he was 6 years old. She turned off the television and covered him with a throw and went to bed. She lay awake for a while in the dark, thinking about what she had told him, about love and its conditions, or more precisely, its lack of them. About the difference between the love you give because of who someone is to you on paper and the love you give because of the 20 years of actual living that have accumulated between you. Logan was not her biological grandson. He was also the child she had fed Sunday dinners to for 19 years and worried about when he had fever and celebrated when he got into college and loved in the daily and unglamorous and unshakable way that love built from time works. She had not chosen to love him strategically. She had just loved him over time because that is what people do with the children in their lives when they are paying attention. And she was not going to unlearn it because the biology turned out to be different from what she had believed. Love was not the same thing as blood. She had known this in the abstract for her entire adult life. She understood it in her body now, at 72, in the way you understand things that have cost you something real. She fell asleep. In the morning, Logan made coffee, badly but with good intention, and they sat on the porch together while the light came up over the ocean, and she thought, whatever this family becomes on the other side of everything that has happened, this is still part of it. This moment. This boy on this porch with his bad coffee and his father's eyes. Some things survive what tries to destroy them. That was the thing worth holding on to. The Amelia Whitmore Legacy Foundation was incorporated 4 months after the board meeting, named for Evelyn's mother, who had been a school teacher for 38 years in a small town in North Carolina, and who had told Evelyn when she was 11 years old that the only thing no one could take from you was what you knew and what you had made of it. Evelyn had spent 60 years proving her right. The foundation's mandate was specific: merit-based scholarships for students who demonstrated not academic achievement alone, though that was a component, but a particular quality that was harder to measure and more important than grades. The intake process included essays, interviews, and references from people who had watched the applicant work through difficulty. The selection committee looked for the specific combination of intelligence and persistence and willingness to start over when things went wrong that Evelyn had come to understand over 50 years, as the quality that actually determined whether a person could build something that lasted. The first year, the foundation awarded 11 scholarships. The second year, 23. By the third year, the Amelia Whitmore Legacy Foundation had a waiting list and a reputation that had spread beyond South Carolina, and Evelyn spent more of her time than she had anticipated reading applications. Personally, not through a committee filter, not through a summary document, but the actual applications, the actual essays, the actual handwriting of young people who were trying to explain who they were and what they were capable of in the hope that someone would believe them. She believed most of them. Not the polished ones, necessarily. Not the applications that had been professionally edited into smooth, technically correct expressions of ambition. The ones she believed were the ones that were a little rough around the edges. The ones where you could see the person behind the words, working at the language, not always finding it, but reaching for it with a specific earnestness that no amount of professional polish could imitate. Those were her people. She knew the type. The ownership restructuring of Whitmore Global Shipping was finalized in the 14th month after the board meeting. It was a complicated process that required more legal work than Evelyn had time to fully oversee, which was why she was grateful for Victor's team and for Sandra Okafor's steady management of the operational side during the months when Evelyn's attention was divided between the company, the foundation, the ongoing legal proceedings, and the various personal threads that were still working themselves toward resolution. The restructuring did not transfer ownership to a single heir. It established an employee ownership trust that granted 10% of company equity to be held collectively by employees who had served more than 5 years, with additional equity accumulating at defined intervals. The remaining controlling interest stayed with Evelyn, with provisions for a board-managed transition upon her death or voluntary retirement. Nathan was offered a role in the restructured management structure, not an executive position, not immediately, but a real role with real responsibilities and real accountability, contingent on demonstrated performance over a 12-month period. He accepted. They had a conversation about it that lasted 2 hours and covered both the practical terms and the more complicated personal ones. Nathan came to her office for it, not the house, her office, because she wanted the boundary to be clear, wanted him to understand that this was a business decision as well as a family one, and that the two were not the same thing even when the people involved were related. He understood. He sat across from her at the desk that had been his father's and listened to what she expected and what she would not tolerate, and what the path forward looked like from her perspective. And he asked practical questions and did not argue about the things that weren't negotiable. Before he left, he said, "I know I should have done more, stopped it sooner, come to you earlier. I know." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She let that sit for a moment, then, "But you're here now, and what you do from here is what I'm actually watching." He nodded. At the door, he paused. "Dad would have—" He stopped, started again. "I think he'd be proud of you for fighting for it." "Richard would have said something self-deprecating and then gone out and done exactly what needed doing," she said, "which is what I tried to do." Nathan almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what he would have done." He left. Evelyn sat at the desk for a moment. Then she opened the folder in front of her and kept working. The conversation with Logan about his paternity happened on a Sunday afternoon in the spring, 8 months after the board meeting, in Evelyn's garden, the garden that had gone untended in the weeks after Richard's funeral, and that she had spent the better part of 3 months slowly restoring to something that resembled what it had been. It was Nathan who told him. Evelyn was present, but Nathan spoke. He had written out what he wanted to say, and then, in the actual conversation, put the paper aside and said it differently. Not in the prepared words, but in the approximate direction of them. Honest. Imperfect. Trying. Logan sat very still for a long time when Nathan finished. Then he said, "Does he know? Does Brett Calloway know about me?" "Not yet," Nathan said. "That's going to be your decision. When you're ready, if you're ready, there's no obligation." Logan was quiet for another long moment, looking at the garden, at a rosebush that Evelyn had cut back hard in March that was now, in April, putting out new growth along every stem. "Are you still my dad?" he asked Nathan. Nathan's voice, when he answered, had the quality of someone saying something very simple that has taken a very long time to be able to say simply. "Yes," he said. "I am still your dad." Logan nodded once. "Okay," he said. Sat for another moment. "Okay." He didn't say anything else for a while, neither did Nathan. Evelyn sat between them in the garden that she had been rebuilding, in the spring light, and she let them have the silence, because some things need silence more than they need words, and she was old enough to know the difference. Eventually, Logan looked at her. "Grammy," he said, the name he had called her since he was 3 years old and could not manage the full word. "Did you know? About all of it? Did you know for a long time?" "No," she said. "I found out during the investigation, not long before the board meeting." "And you still—" He gestured vaguely at the garden, at the space around them, at the fact of her presence. "You still—" "Logan," she said, "you have been my grandson since the day you were born. That is not a biological fact. It is a life fact. It is 20 years of Sunday dinners and bad cold remedies and helping you study for your SATs and sitting in the audience at your high school graduation. Biology does not produce that. Time does. Attention does. Love does." She looked at him steadily. "I am still your grandmother." He put his hand over his eyes. His shoulders moved once. He was 19 years old and he had just had the ground shifted under him in a way that was going to take a long time to fully settle, and he was managing it the way young people manage things that are too big for them, imperfectly, with effort, with the particular dignity of someone who is not going to fall apart completely even when they want to. She put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said in that moment. They sat in the garden until the light started to change, and then Evelyn went inside and made coffee and put food on the table, and the three of them ate together, imperfectly, quietly, with the specific awkward warmth of a family that has been through something genuinely hard and is still, despite everything, at the same table. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the most important thing. Evelyn turned 73 in October, 5 months after the garden conversation, 14 months after the board meeting, 2 months after Vanessa's sentencing, and 1 month before Marcus Vane's. She did not have a party. She was not someone who had ever found parties for herself particularly appealing, and she was less inclined toward them now than she had ever been. Nathan and Logan came for dinner, which Patricia attended as well. She had remained in Charleston, had accepted a position with a forensic accounting firm that Evelyn had recommended her to, and had become, in the quiet and gradual way of people who do difficult things together, a person Evelyn considered a genuine friend. They ate. They talked. Nathan and Logan argued mildly about something to do with the college football team, which was the kind of argument that contains no real stakes and exists primarily as a vehicle for the pleasure of disagreement between people who are comfortable with each other. Patricia told a story about a client that was funnier than it probably should have been, given that it involved someone's fairly serious financial mismanagement, and Evelyn laughed at it, really laughed, in a way that felt like something coming back. After dinner, after Nathan and Logan had gone, Patricia and Evelyn sat with wine on the back porch, the porch that looked over the garden, the restored garden, the rose bushes that had come back harder than before after she cut them down. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. She asked it the way she asked most things, directly, without cushioning. Evelyn thought about it honestly. "Some days," she said, "more days than not. That's better than before." Considerably. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What's next? For the company? For the foundation?" "For everything," Evelyn said. "Something. I don't know exactly what shape yet." She looked at the garden. "Richard used to say that the problem with finishing things is that you immediately start thinking about what you're going to do next, which means you never actually experience finishing." She paused. He was right. "I have never been good at finishing." "I've noticed," Patricia said, without judgment. Evelyn looked at her. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." Patricia took a sip of her wine. "From where I'm sitting, it looks like a feature." Evelyn looked back at the garden, at the rose bushes in the October evening, stripped back now by the beginning of fall, but carrying in their structure the evidence of the spring, the new canes, the places where something had been cut away and something had grown back in its place. She thought about what the past 14 months had cost: the sleep, the grief, the sustained attention, the specific loneliness of carrying something too large and too dangerous to share with most people. She thought about Richard, whose absence was not something she had finished feeling, would not finish feeling, and had stopped expecting to finish feeling. You do not finish grieving a person you spent 48 years loving. You just learn to carry it differently. She thought about the employees who had gotten their retirement savings back, about Gerald Owens and his 31 years and his 4 paragraphs, about the 11 scholarship students in the first year and the 23 in the second, and the young people with their rough-edged applications reaching toward something with an earnestness that moved her. She thought about Nathan at the door of her office, saying he should have done more. She thought about Logan in the garden, asking if Nathan was still his dad. She thought about what it meant to fight for something. Not the dramatic version, not the version where fighting means a single confrontation and a clean resolution. The real version, the daily, grinding, unsexy version, where fighting means paying attention when it would be easier not to, means building backup systems out of basic caution, means sitting at a desk at 11 o'clock at night reading documents that are breaking your heart while your forensic accountant makes tea in your kitchen. That version. The one that actually protects things. You could not love something fully and be willing to surrender it. Those two things could not coexist. If you loved it, truly, in the specific and daily and costly way that love actually operates, then when it was threatened, you did not surrender. You documented, you planned, you waited for the right moment. You walked into a boardroom in a charcoal gray suit and you sat down in your own chair and you refused to sign. Not because you were fearless, you were not fearless. Evelyn had been afraid plenty of times in the past 14 months, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. She had been afraid the night Patricia showed her the retirement fund shortfall, And she had been afraid the morning of the board meeting, and she had been afraid in the weeks between, when she lay awake in the dark, wondering if what she had built was strong enough to hold against what was coming. Fear was not the opposite of courage. Fear was just what you felt on the way to doing the thing anyway. She had done the thing anyway. She was still here. The company was still here, smaller in some ways than it had been, diminished in the short term by the disruption and the legal cloud and the operational uncertainty, but fundamentally intact, the systems still running, the vessels still moving, the 743 employees still employed, and their futures restored. Sandra Okafor was steady at the helm of day-to-day operations, reliable in a way that Evelyn found deeply reassuring, not because she wanted to step away completely, but because she wanted to be sure that what she had built could outlast her without requiring her to be present in every room for it to function. That was what a legacy actually was. Not a name on a building, not a line in a will, the capacity to continue. The sun finished setting. The garden went to dark, and then to the particular soft darkness of a clear October night, with a half moon and the smell of the coast coming off the water. Patricia had gone inside half an hour ago, given Evelyn the space without being asked. Evelyn sat alone on the porch. She was 73 years old. She had buried her husband, fought for her company, restored what had been stolen, protected the people who had trusted her, and renegotiated her understanding of her own family on the other side of discoveries that would have leveled a less stubborn person. She was tired. She was not finished. Those two things had always been true simultaneously, and she expected they would continue to be. She thought, this is what I know now, that I did not fully know before. That the people who love what you've built more than they love you will always reveal themselves eventually. That the people who love you will reveal themselves too, in harder ways, in ways that require you to hold complexity rather than reach for simplicity. That loyalty is not guaranteed by blood or by years or by proximity. It is demonstrated in small moments by what people do when it costs them something to do the right thing. She knew who had done the right thing and who had not. She would not forget either. She thought, I fought for this not because it was mine. I fought for it because it was built by two people who worked for 50 years and deserved to have that work mean something, and because 743 people built their lives around it, and because there were young people with rough-edged essays who needed the scholarship money that only existed because the company continued to operate, and because the right things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is unglamorous and expensive and conducted mostly in the dark. She thought Richard would have found all of this, the parallel system, the 5 weeks of investigation, the boardroom, the whole careful structure of it, simultaneously very funny and entirely predictable. He would have said, I told you you were the stronger one. She would have told him not to be smug. He would have laughed. She sat in that thought for a while. Let herself have it fully, the way she was learning, slowly, to let herself have things fully, rather than managing them into something more controllable. Then she got up, her left knee making its customary complaint, and she went inside and she turned off the porch light and she went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do. She had never minded that. She still didn't. She thought, this is what I know now, that I did not fully know before. That the people who love what you've built more than they love you will always reveal themselves eventually. That the people who love you will reveal themselves too, in harder ways, in ways that require you to hold complexity rather than reach for simplicity. That loyalty is not guaranteed by blood or by years or by proximity. It is demonstrated in small moments by what people do when it costs them something to do the right thing. She knew who had done the right thing and who had not. She would not forget either. She thought, I fought for this not because it was mine. I fought for it because it was built by two people who worked for 50 years and deserved to have that work mean something. And because 743 people built their lives around it. And because there were young people with rough-edged essays who needed the scholarship money that only existed because the company continued to operate. And because the right things are worth fighting for even when the fight is unglamorous and expensive and conducted mostly in the dark. She thought, Richard would have found all of this, the parallel system, the 5 weeks of investigation, the boardroom, the whole careful structure of it, simultaneously very funny and entirely predictable. He would have said, I told you you were the stronger one. She would have told him not to be smug. He would have laughed. She sat in that thought for a while. Let herself have it fully, the way she was learning, slowly, to let herself have things fully, rather than managing them into something more controllable. Then she got up, her left knee making its customary complaint, and she went inside and she turned off the porch light and she went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do. She had never minded that. She still didn't.